welcome back to the France 24 debate. David Cameron is inside the Elysee Palace even now, trying to renegotiate or convince François Hollande to think about renegotiating some of the EU's founding treaties. For now, the precise details of the sorts of reform he's looking for are not known. Simply that ahead of the UK's referendum on the matter in 2017, possibly even next year, say the British now, that the British want to see changes to the Union that could require treaty changes. So deep are they? Those are the images of David Cameron arriving and being greeted earlier by François Hollande. It is the day one of a whistle-stop tour that will see him take his charm offensive to several European capitals. Earlier today he was in The Hague. Tomorrow he'll be in Warsaw and in Berlin for lunch with Angela Merkel. The beginning of the British attempt to convince European partners that the European Union needs to be changed. Now, can he do it? Can the EU really be reformed? Should it be reformed? And how? That's what we're going to discuss tonight on The Debate. I'm joined here in the studio by Christophe Robit, who's our Europe editor. Christophe, thank you for being with us. Hello. As well. By Hélène Conway-Mouret, who's a senator from the French Socialist Party. We're joined also from London by Paweł Swidlicki, who's a policy analyst at Open Europe. We're also going to be joined, I believe, by a Charles Tannock, who's a Conservative MP and who joins us as well. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. If you could give us, first of all, Christophe, a little idea of what David Cameron is hoping to achieve. What is he going to be asking his EU partners for?
Well, as you know, Melissa, the British Prime Minister, who recently won a resounding victory in the British elections, has vowed to renegotiate the terms of Britain's EU membership. We still don't know what this exactly means, but what we know is that David Cameron wants what he calls a better Europe. Probably what he means is less Europe, and he will put the end result to British voters in an in-out referendum before the end of 2017, as you said, possibly as early as next year. Now, to be more concrete, we know a number of things. For instance, the British Prime Minister wants to crack down on what he calls benefits tourism. The idea that allegedly EU migrants who travel to Britain abuse the British welfare system. He wants, for instance, to make sure that EU migrants can't claim any benefits for 4 years. We also know that he wants less regulatory intervention coming from Brussels to protect the interest of the city. We also know, for instance, that he wants a mechanism to safeguard the interest of non-Euro members, because the reality since the beginning of the Eurozone crisis is that the Eurozone has moved closer into integration. And that's something that the British are very wary of, because they don't want decisions to be made at the level of the 19 Eurozone countries to discriminate against the interest of Britain.
If we begin on the broad question of whether the EU needs to be reformed, before moving into the specifics, Hélène Conway-Mouret, what is your view? Can the EU continue to function as it is? Or is it time, as there seem to be a growing number of calls, and not only from parts of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, but from other parts of Europe as well, a growing number of calls for something to be done for the European Union to be profoundly reformed and changed?
Well, I think everybody wants a better Europe. I think that in today's world, we are all aware of the strengths that we have to have a market of 500 million people. We know, and I travel extensively, that there is a need for Europe as a compensation for maybe a tight relationship with the United States in the past, and that's good for the Middle East at the moment, where there is a shift towards us. So I think that, yes, of course, reforms are always good. What we have at the moment is not perfect and needs to be profoundly, I'm not sure, but it needs to be reformed. And I think that what is being proposed broadly, everybody agrees with. We need to have tighter rules on immigration, on social benefits. We today see a lot of people migrating from the south, from Africa, crossing the Mediterranean, trying to come up north, and of course landing on European shores. And we need to have these policies put in place on how to deal with that. And I think we can do it better as a European Union than we can do it individually, and trying to address, for instance, Italy is unable today to address the problem of migration.
But
of
and yet David Cameron goes slightly further. He wants the UK to be able to deny benefits, for instance, to other EU citizens. Presumably, you don't agree with that.
No.
No. What about
But,
his? What about
well,
his?
I belong to the Socialist Party, and of course, I think the solidarity, continental solidarity, is one of the pillars of socialism.
And yet,
so I will go against what I believe in.
Charles Tannock, that is specifically one of the things that David Cameron is going to be seeking as he makes his way around Europe.
Absolutely. Good evening. I'm an MEP, by the way, and I'm in Brussels. No, absolutely. David Cameron is right. Unfortunately, there is a problem that we have in the United Kingdom, that we have a very generous non-contributory system. i.e., it was designed for a period before there was mass movement of people. And unlike France or Germany, where you have to pay in for some time before you get meaningful benefits out, in Britain, from day one, you get access to subsidized housing, child benefit, child tax credits, and so on. And clearly, it's been worked out that even if you are working on an average industrial wage as an immigrant from, say, another European country, you are getting something like £7,000 a year in work benefits. Now, that amounts to a figure which is as great as the minimum wage in countries like Romania or Bulgaria. So it's a huge pull factor to people coming to Britain. And we just had the figures for last year, something like 300,000 net migrants to Britain, the gross figure in excess of 500,000. The numbers are very, very high. There's huge pressure on our public resources, on health, on education, on housing stock, and so on. And I live in London, and I'm well aware of that as a parent myself of young children. And so it's absolutely clear from the general election, at the doorstep, immigration was a very big issue, and fairness in access to welfare benefits is also deemed to be a very important issue by the British people. So I think this will be one of David Cameron's top priorities, to reduce the pull factor and to make sure that you only start to get things out of the British welfare system when you've made a meaningful tax contribution into the system first. And it's been calculated that something like 4 years is what's required. And that is what I understand David Cameron's team and in particular George Osborne, who's leading on it, as well as Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, will be putting down as one of the essential areas where we need to repatriate certain powers. Now, whether this requires treaty change or whether it can be done by legislation is not entirely clear. I understand the government law officers are saying this requires a treaty change. What's clearer is that one of the other red lines
I'd just like to
put that...
one of
the other red lines is ever closer political union.
If we could come back to that in a moment, the question of ever closer political union. We'll move on to that in a second. Just on the question, though, of the changes that were just being discussed, Pavel Svidlicki, it does suggest what we just heard from Charles Tannock may make sense to plenty of people, may indeed be what many British people, the kind of change many British people want to see. But it does go against not only the spirit of the EU, but the treaties that are in place currently and that underpin its very existence.
Thank you. I'd actually have to disagree with that argument, because the principle is that EU migrants who come to the UK have to be self-sufficient. So people who come over and are only self-sufficient because they are then eligible to claim in-work benefits, which, as Charles said, are quite generous and are non-contributory, then they're not really self-sufficient. So I think it's about asserting that principle and about making the system fair, while also maintaining the right to free movement, which is in the treaties, and which David Cameron has said that he will not seek to fundamentally change. So I think that combination of making the system fairer and ensuring that EU migrants who come over have to contribute to the system before they are eligible to claim benefits. I think if David Cameron can really frame the argument in those terms, he has a much better chance of getting support from other member states.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, you agree?
Yeah, I think that, before looking at reforming the treaties, and which take decades at best, and I don't see how anything can be put in place before the referendum, especially if it is called in 2016, which could be the case. David Cameron can well think that he is not going to wait for 2 years until maybe the British public is using the referendum as a way to express maybe resentment if there are further public cuts and so on. A referendum is not always used, or the answer given not always to the question posed. So I think that reforms ought to be carried out within the countries themselves, and indeed the French government is carrying out a number of reforms, and in this case maybe it's time for Britain to look at the reality today of migration and so on, and put in place reforms that will address those matters without seeking to go to Europe and maybe finding it difficult to have anything put in place for a referendum that then would be called as the promise has been made.
Christophe Raby, do you agree? Do you believe that changes can be made, sort of not quite a tinkering, but slightly less than a treaty change, something that would allow David Cameron to go back to his public and say, look, we've agreed at this on European level, and these are the changes I'm going to be able to put into effect even now?
I think a lot of things are possible at EU level. When you look at how the Eurozone crisis has been handled, a lot of things that were actually decided looked almost totally impossible 5 years ago. I think Europe is all about plumbing and DIY. You always find solutions. Having said that, let's remember the psychological aspect of the question. It's been exactly 10 years today since the French rejected the European Constitution in a referendum, followed by the Dutch. And that explains why there is so little appetite in Berlin, in The Hague, in Paris for treaty change, because it's a very long, a very cumbersome process. It needs to be put to a vote in parliaments, in countries like Ireland, by popular vote. And at this stage, obviously, this is something that neither Merkel nor Hollande are ready to do, not least because we know that Euroscepticism is rising across Europe. So what they're trying to do is solve all the problems step by step by finding little small solutions. But treaty change, I believe, is definitely a red line for the French and the Germans.
Now, on the other issue that Charles Alec was about to raise and that I wish to come back to, which is we know very little about the precise detail of what David Cameron is going to be asking. We know about two things. We know about changes to the question of migrants and the benefits to which they have access. The other big point that we've had explained to us is that he will be seeking to change, to row back on that fundamental principle, which is at the heart of the EU, of ever greater integration. As far as you're concerned, Charles Tannock, will that be at the heart of what David Cameron is seeking?
Well, obviously, I'm not privy to exactly what the Prime Minister is going to demand, but my understanding is that the term ever closer political union is a very sensitive one in Britain, which wants to be more semi-detached and not part of the ever closer integrating Eurozone, for instance, which will have to go a lot further in order to have the economic cohesion to make the Eurozone work. We want to have some guarantees as well that the Eurozone can't caucus together to stop us having access to the single market or protecting our financial services in London. But certainly it would be good, and I think it's a very important issue, that there's a derogation, at least for the United Kingdom, to not be part of the term ever closer political union, because that's a very sensitive one. It's a one that unfortunately UKIP play on a lot. And I think we need to have a much more flexible Europe with variable geometry, with different sort of types of a commitment to political and economic integration. And I think David Cameron certainly would regard that as an important issue to be negotiated. And of course, we can look at the 1992 model with Denmark after their referendum, whereby it was possible as an interim measure to have a number of solemn political declarations by the member states to change certain aspects of the treaty at a later date if there isn't the time available to do so. And I think that may be sufficient. Certainly, subsequently, Denmark managed to get its opt-outs, which were agreed to in 92-93. So I think that may be a model that will be unearthed and looked at very closely. But one thing you can be sure is that David Cameron and his team are very committed to renegotiating. In my view, I don't accept anybody who says in France or Germany these are non-negotiable issues. everything is negotiable, and even the issue of freedom of movement. I mean, David Cameron's made it very clear he believes in freedom of movement of the right to seek work, but obviously not the right to become a burden on other member states' taxpayers. Even that is, there's a permanent derogation in Malta, for instance, against permanent about freedom of movement to people to live in Malta. So everything is possible if there is the political will. And as I said only earlier today to a Portuguese...
I'd like to just put that to Christoph. The idea that ever greater European integration could be moved away from, is that something you foresee happening?
If you look at Europe today, I think that the British Prime Minister ought not to be too worried, because we live in a Europe, in a two-speed Europe, in a two-tier Europe, where you have a highly integrated Eurozone. Not all Eurozone countries were willing to further integrate, but it was the only solution to save the common currency. At the same time, you see that the other countries, Sweden, Britain, are more interested, for instance, in things like access to the single market. So the reality today is that we already see that we live in a two-tier Europe. What I find very interesting in David Cameron's argument is that he seems worried about the situation, because what he doesn't want is that those 19 countries, Eurozone countries, caucus together and make decisions that could discriminate against Britain. But this is interesting, because this is an acknowledgement by the British Prime Minister that Britain needs to be in Europe, that Britain needs a voice, needs a say in Europe. But the reality, as we said, is that the Eurozone is moving closer, the rest of Europe follows. And let's remind our viewers that Britain is not in the Eurozone, it's not in Schengen, it has a series of opt-outs, it has a rebate, so it already has an a la carte arrangement.
We're going to come back to all of that in the second part of tonight's debate. A quick break, and I'll be right back with the headlines and the second part of tonight's France 24 debate. Do stay with us.